Oh, hello there. Wake up, it's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm that newsman, Sam Sachs. And we begin this morning at The Hague, where the nation of South Africa is making its case before the International Court of Justice that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. Lawyers cited the staggering Palestinian death toll, more than 23,000 killed by the Israeli military in Gaza, including about 10,000 children. That mass killing is a genocidal act, South Africa argued. Also presented to the court is Israel's siege of civilian populations, cutting off water, electricity, and medical supplies, the Israeli military's targeting of infrastructure and of hospitals. And to establish intentionality, lawyers cited the persistent genocidal rhetoric used by members of the Israeli government. Here was an excerpt from the proceedings.
Israel continues to target infrastructure essential for survival. Water and sanitation infrastructure, solar panels, bakeries, mills, crops. It bombs hospitals, decimating the healthcare system. It targets aid workers and the infrastructure of the United Nations. It is because of the policy of Israel that Gaza has become a place of death and despair. In conclusion, Madam President, many propagators of grave atrocities have protested that they were misunderstood, that they did not mean what they said, and that their own words were taken out of context. What state would admit to a genocidal intent? Yet, the distinctive feature of this case has not been the silence as such, but the reiteration and repetition of genocidal speech throughout every sphere of state in Israel. We remind the court of the identity and authority of the genocidal inciters: the Prime Minister, the President, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of National Security, the Minister of Energy and Infrastructure, members of the Knesset, senior army officials, and foot soldiers. Genocidal utterances are therefore not out in the fringes. They are embodied in state policy.
Now, tomorrow, representatives for Israel will defend their position to the panel of 15 international judges. A final verdict is unlikely anytime soon. In fact, it could take years. But if the court determines it does have jurisdiction and there is merit in South Africa's case, it could issue interim orders in the next few weeks to require Israel to cease its military operations. The court's orders are legally binding, but it doesn't have a police or military force to actually enforce those orders. So Israel could simply ignore what the ICJ rules. South Africa could take the issue up to the UN Security Council to get an ICJ order enforced, but the United States would veto any such move in order to protect Israel. Still, this is not a quixotic endeavor. To the extent that international law exists on this planet, it must reckon with what's happening in Gaza. And this would be the first time the ICJ has agreed to hear a case involving Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Both Israel and South Africa are among 150 nations that are signatories to the Genocide Convention, which doesn't just forbid countries from doing genocides, but requires them to actively stop those genocides as well. And the only two countries that are living up to the obligation so far are South Africa by bringing this case and the Houthis in Yemen by enforcing a blockade on Israel. South Africa's case does have the support of more than a dozen nations, including Brazil, Turkey, and Pakistan. The coalition of countries that make up the Arab League announced support for the case on Wednesday. And ahead of today's proceedings, the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium said that she was calling on her government to support South Africa's legal efforts as well, which would be the first Western European country to do so. The UK's former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, also supports the suit. as does a member of the Israeli Knesset, left-wing lawmaker Ofer Kasif. He said this week, quote, "My constitutional duty is to Israeli society and all of its residents, not to a government whose members and its coalition are calling for ethnic cleansing and even actual genocide. They are the ones who hurt the country and the people. They are the ones who led South Africa to turn to The Hague, not me and my friends." And when the government acts against society, the state, and its citizens, especially when it sacrifices them and commits crimes in their name on the altar of maintaining its existence, it is my right and even my duty to warn about this and do everything I can within the law to stop it. Kasif now faces a potential expulsion from the Knesset for taking this position. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Biden administration rejects South Africa's case and has called it meritless. This week, a group of lawyers from South Africa sent a letter to President Joe Biden threatening legal action against the U.S. government as well for enabling Israel's genocide. The letter cited the weapons supplied to Israel by the U.S., including tank shells that have killed thousands of civilians. And it concluded, quote, "The U.S. government is hereby placed on notice of our intention to hold it liable for all the atrocities that the Palestinian people have been subjected to since 1917 and will seek various court orders in terms of our international criminal law and international law in general, seeking justice and compensation and repatriation of the Palestinian people." Joe Biden is following in the footsteps of George W. Bush as president of the United States who can't travel overseas due to the risk that they could be arrested and tried for war crimes. The United Auto Workers Union is out here trying to make history. An auto plant in Alabama operated by Mercedes-Benz has more than 30% of its workers now signed on to union cards. Mercedes is one of more than a dozen car companies that are the target of an organizing wave initiated by the UAW in the wake of its victory with the big three automakers at the end of last year. A Volkswagen factory in Tennessee also hit the 30% threshold last month. Both companies defeated all prior attempts to form a union in their shops. But right now, they're dealing with a new force, a UAW under the leadership of a militant president like Shawn Fain. And Fain's vision is to have almost 150,000 new workers unionized across the U.S. auto industry, and he's off to a good start. In another boost to labor's morale, the Department of Labor issued a finalized rule this week to crack down on employers misclassifying their workers as independent contractors. The new regulation broadens the criteria for what defines a worker as an employee and thus entitled to more rights and protections under labor law versus an independent contractor. Unlike contractors, employees receive certain benefits like overtime pay and organizing protections. And bosses have a habit of misclassifying workers who should be employees as contractors instead to avoid paying for those benefits. This is particularly true of a lot of low-wage laborers working in truck driving and construction and at nail salons. And they can miss out on potentially thousands of dollars every year due to their misclassification. The department's new rule reverses a Trump-era regulation that restricted the criteria that would define an employer-employee relationship. Finalizing the new rule marks a rare loss for the forces of capital that lobbied heavily against it. The regulation is set to take effect on March 11th. I know that yesterday's news about 2023 being the hottest year on record went down like a black pill, but here's something that tastes a bit better. A pill a little less black, a gray pill, if you will. An analysis of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2023 showed emissions dropping, and for the first time dropping while the economy grew. Emissions were down almost 2% year over year in 2023. Almost the entirety of the reduction was due to power generating shedding its CO2 burdens, Also, the supplanting of coal with natural gas. CO2 emissions due to transportation, buildings, and industry remained mostly constant. The study was done by the Rhodium Group, but before Biden nerds get all excited about it, don't lose sight of what the point is of these reductions, which is to stave off a planetary catastrophe by revolutionizing how not just the US, but the world powers itself. And right now, despite the decent news out of 2023, the US is not meeting even its most modest obligations. The report concluded, quote, the deadline for the US 2030 climate target under the Paris Agreement of a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels is rapidly approaching, and achievement of that goal looks ever more challenging absent a major new policy push. To meet the Paris target, the US needs to average a 6.9% emissions reduction every year from 2024 through 2030, more than triple the 1.9% drop in 2023. So we're not decarbonizing nearly fast enough. So-called pro-growth liberals will still take this study as confirmation of their slow, practical approach to governance, but deep down they know that the real Dark Brandon would have seized the drilling sites by now. Winter break is over. Class is back in session. It's time for This Week in Working Class History. As always, thanks to the crew at Working Class History who've given us access to their vast archives. And we begin in 1895, when about 5,000 trolley car workers went on strike in Brooklyn. Trolley cars were the most popular mass transit system in the borough at the time, and recently electrified owners saw a chance to maximize services and also profits. But workers wanted their cut too, and didn't want to be overworked in this new electrified system. Another issue workers had was that bosses instructed them to disobey the speed limit, no matter the risks to operators, passengers, and pedestrians. Speed limit at the time was 10 miles per hour, but still, it was a workplace safety issue. Management rejected the workers' demands, so thousands of them, mostly repped by the Knights of Labor, called a strike. Companies tried to bring in scabs, but the strikers were able to outnumber even the police and kept the system paralyzed for days. Only when the National Guard was called in and actually shot people did the owners regain control of the labor struggle. The strike dissolved after several weeks, with none of the workers' demands met, but one of the trolley companies did go bankrupt not too long after. So, at least there's that. Moving along now to 1912 in the Bread and Roses strike. It went down in Lawrence, Massachusetts at the Everett Mills when mostly immigrant women who worked in the textile mills noticed that their pay had been reduced. A new state law mandated that women couldn't work more than 54 hours a week, down from 56. The law did not require mill owners to cut pay by the same amount. They just took the opportunity to do that. And so their workers, mostly wobblies, went on strike and tore the hell out of the mills. The women even sent their kids away to safety so that they could really fuck shit up. The strike gained nationwide attention and engendered a lot of sympathy with the public, especially after stories spread of police beating up female strikers. The Attorney General of the Taft administration investigated the horrible working conditions in the mills. The pressure eventually got to the owners, and they struck a deal, meeting nearly all of the workers' demands. That's how you strike. And finally, let's wrap it up in 1919, the Peru general strike. About a month earlier, workers across the country started walking out of the factories to demand an 8-hour workday. The government had tried to appease the labor force by passing a law that applied the 8-hour limit only to women and children. And although that was a step forward, it meant that men had to work harder to fulfill factory quotas. And so, they went on strike until the law applied to all workers. University students in Lima got involved, and by this week that year, a general strike was called that shut down the capital city. And on the third day of the work stoppage, the government submitted, and President Jose Pardo issued a decree granting all workers an 8-hour workday. Another W for labor. To learn more about these stories and other events that happened this week in working class history, check out the project on social media, listen to the podcast, and subscribe on Patreon. Back with more next week. All right, friends, the show ends this morning with a sunrise from Louisiana. It was sent in by Allison in New Orleans. Enjoy. Thank you, Allison. Show's over. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up at Means TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. One day, capitalism will fall, but until then, we're going to be right here. See you tomorrow.